So you want to start cross-stitching, but you don't know where to start. Well, you're in the right place. This video is going to show you in excruciating detail exactly what you need to cross-stitch and some of the basic tips of actually how to cross-stitch. So we'll start with what you need to have. Really what you're going to need are fabric, threads, needles, hoops, and snippers. We'll get to all of those in order. First, fabric. Now, when buying fabric, you'll notice that on the packaging, they're labeled with different counts, like 14 count, like this stuff is 14 count, for example, or 11 count, or 28 count even. What that means is the amount of stitches per inch. So if you have 14 count, that means there are 14 stitches per inch, and if you have 11 count, there are 11 stitches per inch, and 28 count, which isn't as common, there are 28 stitches per inch. So basically, it's just the size of stitches. So 14 count has smaller stitches, and 11 count has bigger stitches. And really, if you have a pattern or a kit that doesn't tell you what count of fabric to get, it's all up to personal preference. By the way, there are also different colors of cross-stitch fabric. So usually, obviously, you get white, but there's also a bunch of different dyed colors. For example, there's pink, red, black, blue, any color that you can think of, there's a fabric dye for it. Now, usually you want to stick with white because most patterns are based on being on white fabric, but some patterns and some designs you'll notice would look so much cooler on different color fabric. So just be creative. If you think it would look cooler in a different color, then get that different color. Different dyed fabrics aren't as common in craft stores, but you can definitely find as much as you need on Amazon. Second thing you'll need are some threads. They're actually called embroidery floss, and this is the stuff you actually make the design with. It's the stuff that you bring the design to life with, so it's really important. And as you can see, I have my thread collection here, all tied up in little convenient little bobbins in drawers. So I have mine tied up in bobbins like these, but really when you're buying them from the craft store, they look like this. By the way, when you're looking at patterns and you're looking at the colors that you need to buy for said patterns, you'll notice that they're denoted by numbers rather than just names of colors. They do have names, but all patterns usually use the numbers. So the most common, almost ubiquitous, like default brand of embroidery floss is DMC. So these numbers, most of the time, will refer to DMC colors rather than different brands, which have different numbering systems. So I'm pretty sure on all patterns that don't use DMC color numbers, they'll make a note of it. So anyways, just a good thing to know is that this is how threads look when you buy them, and that they have a lot of numbers, and there are a lot of colors. So it's a good thing to know. Third thing you'll need are needles. Now this one's pretty simple because you just need one type of needle. There isn't like a lot of different needles. Oh, by the way, sewing needles, like traditional sewing needles, will work for cross-stitching, but it's just really annoying to use them because they're sharp. Embroidery needles are dull because there are already holes in the fabric, as you saw before. Like the embroidery fabric has holes in it, and so nothing needs to be sharp and pointy to poke through fabric. And so if you have a sharp needle, it'll want to poke through places that it's not supposed to poke through, and so it's just inconvenient. So when you go to the craft store, the needles you'll need are usually going to be in little packs of like 6 or 7, and they'll be labeled embroidery needles. So not necessarily cross-stitch specific needles, but it's all the same. Or if you're really desperate and you don't want to go to the store, but you have a lot of spare sewing needles lying around, I have personally taken sandpaper to needles before just to dull them out so I can use them to cross-stitch. I wouldn't suggest it because it's bad for both the sandpaper and for the needle. But if you want to save a little bit of money, I mean, it's always an option. The fourth thing you'll need are hoops. Now, when you think of traditional embroidery or traditional cross-stitching, people use hoops. They're always like have their fabric in this little nice frame thing and they use it to keep the fabric taut so they can work on their fabric. However, that's becoming less and less necessary, especially as you can see, I like making small things when it comes to cross-stitching. So I didn't need to use a hoop for any of these because if I did, the fabric's too small for a hoop anyways. But if I did, it would just be inconvenient. So if you have stiff cross-stitch fabric where you think that it's stiff enough that you don't really need to pull it taut with a hoop, then you don't need to use one. Obviously, hoops are helpful when you're working on really big projects, but when you're working on small things, or when you're working like just practicing, you're working with really stiff fabric, it's really not that important. And also, you can find hoops at any craft store. There are a bunch of different sizes. It just depends on how you want to work and how big your fabric is. It's all up to you. I mean, there's a lot of self-preference when it comes to cross-stitch. That's kind of the fun of it. So the fifth thing that you need to have, is really simple, and you don't even need to buy it. It's just snippers. And obviously it's more fun to have little little snippers you can cut your thread with, but scissors work. Like, it's more efficient to have snippers, but all you need to have is something that can cut thread, and that's a pretty low bar when it comes to cutting objects. So you can use anything. Obviously, like the snippers that I use are all from China. I get them in like 6 packs. They don't last me forever, but they work and they're cheap. And actually, if you want to make them last longer, you can get a scissors sharpener and put your little snippers in there. You can do the same thing with actual scissors to keep them sharp. I'm just saying. But yeah, so that's really simple. Just something to cut with. So now we're going to get into how to actually cross-stitch. Now you have everything you need. Now you just need to do the thing. First, I'll tell you how to get your floss ready. So here's where you make a choice. If you're using a cross-stitch kit or a cross-stitch pattern, it should already tell you how many strands you're supposed to use. Wait, what are strands? Well, let me tell you. So when you look at embroidery floss closely, you see that it is actually 6 smaller strands that are kind of twisted together to make one big string. Now, 90% of the time, or 95% of the time when you're cross-stitching, you're not going to use all 6 strands, because that's a lot of thread. And especially if you're using a count like this, if you're using 14 count, 6 strands is way too much. It's going to, like, barely go through the holes. So, that means you're going to need to separate it. And so when I'm working on 14 count, I separate it into 2 groups of 3 strands each. But, like I said, a lot of cross-stitch kits and a lot of cross-stitch patterns tell you how many strands they want you to use. So that's a good way to guess. But if you just want to find out how to cross-stitch without using a pattern or without using a kit, then you can just experiment, like whatever looks better. So the fewer strands you use, the thinner the thread is going to be that you're going to be cross-stitching with, and that means that you're going to have more white within your stitches when you're cross-stitching. The more threads you have, the thicker it'll be, the more dense it'll look. It's all up to personal preference, like I said, or like stylistic choice or whatever. So let me show you the trick to getting it separated successfully, because it's really easily knotted at this point. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cut off the length of the thread that you think you'll need for the section that you'll be working on. Once you have that, and for this example, let's say you're splitting into 2 groups of 3 strands, you want to hold it so that the floss is hanging free in the air, and so it's not sitting on your lap, it's not sitting on anything, it's just hanging. So you start from the very top, you separate the strands, and then you slowly pull them apart. Not too fast because you'll knot it. But if you go slow and you just let the bottom part of the string just like twist free, then it should not knot. And then once you get to the bottom, boom, you have your 2 threads with 3 strands each. So there you go. Just experiment with how many strands looks the best on the fabric you're working on and on the design you're working on. Like I said, again, for the 5th time in this video, it's all up to personal preference. Do what you like. Do whatever you think looks good. But now that you have your strand ready to cross-stitch with, now you need to do 2 things to it before you can actually cross-stitch with it. One is to get the knot in it, and the second thing is to thread it onto a needle. So let's start with the knot, because that's the harder part. So if you've ever done a sewing knot before, if you ever have hand sewn and you've known how to do that knot, it's the same thing. It's, so you can skip the section if you already know how to do a sewing knot, because it's just that. But it is a bit tricky if you've never done it before. So I'm going to try and explain to the best of my ability how to do it the best, and how to get the best kind of knot for the back of your cross stitch, so it's nice and smooth. So first you're going to want to start with the tip of your thread between your index finger and your thumb, and then you're going to wrap the hanging thread around your index finger a couple of times so you can take your thumb off and it doesn't fall off. And the more times you wrap it around, the bigger the knot's going to be, so I'd say a default is like 2 or 3 times you're going to want to wrap it around. Next you want to press the top of your thumb against the strands and push the strands off the tip of your finger, letting them twist and roll in on themselves. If they don't roll in on themselves, then you won't have a knot, so make sure that that happens. Lastly, you're just going to want to pull it tight, and congrats, you have a knot. If it's a big monster knot, that's fine. You'll get better at it over time. It doesn't really matter because no one else is going to be looking at the back of your cross stitch except for you. So if you have monster knots and you don't care, then it doesn't matter. So let's thread the needle next. There are ways that you can thread it without using a threader, which I can do, but really, just use a threader. They're really cheap. They come with most hand sewing kits, and they're just faster for the beginner. And once you get it down, you can figure out ways where you like lick the strand and then like stick it through the needle, and you can thread it that way. But really, just use a threader for the time being, or just be really patient and figure it out for yourself, because it's really hard to explain how to thread a needle correctly just eyeballing it. So yeah, just make it easy on yourself and just get a threader or something. So now we're gonna actually do some cross stitching. So now that you have all the things you need, and now that you know how to get your thread ready to actually cross stitch, let's do it. This is very exciting. So before you actually start on your first project, like your first pattern or your first kit or your first design, I would strongly suggest practicing a little square of fabric first so that you can make all your mistakes, and then when you work on your project, it'll be perfect. Because I don't want you to mess up your first project, because that's really sad. So anyways, let's start with just 1 stitch. First, make sure that the string on your needle has the knotted end hanging out longer, and then just stick it through the back of your fabric. For now, we're just practicing. It doesn't really matter where you do it, but for the future, you will want to be aware of exactly where your stitch is going to go. And then, once you have it sticking out through the back, you can pull it all the way to where the knot stops it. So then you're going to stick your needle through the top of the fabric, just to the hole up and to the right. So you just have a little diagonal line. Congrats! You did your first half stitch! So then you're going to stick your needle back through the fabric, just to the right of the one you started with, so just below the one that you just went through. So instead of the bottom left, you're going to go to the bottom right hole. You're just going to stick it through there until the thread stops. And then you're going to go through, you guessed it, top left. Just to make your nice little X. And voila! You have your first stitch. is just bottom left to top right, bottom right to top left. Simple as that, right? So you've done your first stitch. Congratulations. So there is one other technique that I want to show you that will really help you get your patterns done faster and save you thread. I don't know the official term for it, but it's just doing a row of half stitches and then going back over that row and finishing off the stitches. It's just a more thread efficient way to fill in big chunks of color, basically. Oh, something to remember. Whenever I see beginners try and cross stitch, they always forget which side of the fabric their thread is on. So if you pull it through the top of the thread and then I see them push it through the back of the fabric, right after that, and then you get the weird loop thing, and it's not very good. So you just want to be really aware of where your thread is and what your thread is doing at all times, just to make it easier for yourself. So, now that you've done your first stitch, and I've taught you how to do the half stitch row thing, that's all you really need to know. Like, cross-stitching is really easy. Most of this video is just how to get you started cross-stitching, but once you have the stuff you need and you know the basics, you can just go for it. Like, it's really simple. As long as you know what your thread is doing all the time, then it's not very hard. So here is a pattern that you can use, and it's a great way to practice on a small little piece of fabric on how to do a basic pattern. So you can either start from the top down or the bottom up. I usually do the bottom up, but top down works just the same. It's just a great way of figuring out how to do a pattern, because doing one stitch and doing a pattern aren't necessarily the same thing.